This is by Robert Polidori of an abandoned gas station which has since become the visitors center in Palm Springs. Um, it's an exposure that has some time to it. We can tell by the blur of the palm trees, but the pink of the building and those abutments is beautiful in contrast to the blue sky and the clouds surrounding the mountains in the background. This is also Robert Polidori, and I believe it's in Havana where he spent a fair amount of time photographing. This is Central Park from a unusual point of view, showing the architecture on the left, breaking the frame in two with it, and then seeing the trees and the skyline in the background with what looks like a painted sky. Polidori also spent some time in New Orleans after Katrina, documenting what had happened. This is by Shimon Ati, who projects images onto buildings, adding to the layering of information that's already there, giving it another dimension altogether. This is by Louis Baltz, whose work we've already seen, black and white work. He works primarily in color now. And he said that the tract homes scared him, and I think he's still scared by things, and finds a way to photograph them. The subject matter is just different now. There's another Baltz. And there's something about that light shining at the camera that makes me feel like I'm under surveillance. We can tell this is a long exposure because of the blurred streaks of the headlights going by in the foreground. This is by Olivo Barbieri, an Italian photographer, who has photographed extensively from the air. And he uses a lens on his camera called a tilt shift, and it allows him to be very selective in his focus. The end result of a lot of these images is that the buildings look like scale models. And this is in fact the Pacific Design Center in Hollywood, West Hollywood in Los Angeles. And it's very much a real building. And here we have, I believe it's the Piazza di Popolo in Rome. And again, with this sense that we're looking at just scale models of things. This is by Jeff Browse, American photographer, who is interested in the urban and rural environments, and has been documenting them in different ways for quite a while. I would say that his style is non-hierarchical. All of these objects have the same importance in this image. The Christmas ornaments and the Santa are the same as the ketchup bottle and the sugar container, and the house in the background and the cars. He's also photographed carnivals pretty extensively. In this case, with just this lone light on. It reminds me of Edward Hopper's Nighthawks. Just enough information of the whatever the ride is in the background to tell us that we're looking at a carnival. This is by Edward Bertinsky, who's concerned with the environment and has photographed in remote areas, in particular where mining and various other activities have dominated the landscape. This is a factory by Bertinsky. And a stage, I believe, in Russia. This is by Patty Carroll, a motel in Las Vegas with extraordinary reflections in the wet pavement in the foreground and the pool a little bit further. Amazing colors. This is by Robert Flick, who now photographs with video cameras taking still images, I believe every second, and he mounts them in his car and then mounts all of the images together, he assembles them in Photoshop and then puts them all together. This is actually one of the more modest compositions. Some of them involve hundreds of images. The intention being that the cumulative effect of all of these images has a different impact than the individual frames. This is by Andreas Gursky, 99-cent store, photographed in Los Angeles. Gursky's a German photographer. And prints of this are approximately 20 feet wide, so you have some sense of the scale of it. They're actually done in 2 panels and mounted together. But the impact of an actual print is extraordinary. This is also Gursky. As is this. I believe this is the Hyatt in San Francisco. And architecture of a very different nature is something that Alex Harris has been interested in documenting. This is a house in Mexico. This is by Anthony Hernandez, and he's interested in the built environment. This is a shaft of some sort in an industrial building. It's been abandoned. He also did a series of images of homeless encampments. This is by Evelyn Hofer, another German photographer who studied with the Beckers, as did Andreas Gursky and Thomas Struth. And she has photographed extensively in amphitheaters, theaters, large gathering places of one kind or another. This is by Astrid Cruz Jensen, who's done a series of houses, remote houses with pools, and taken at a time of day when it's almost completely dark, but there's just still enough light in the sky that we see that there are hills or mountains behind the house. This is by Henrik Kam, and I like it for the juxtaposition of the car wash in the foreground and what appears to be a centuries-old castle on top of a hill in the background. This is by Thomas Kellner, whose strategy is to create photographs, to create images using many images. Each one of these frames is a 35 millimeter frame, and he pans across and very carefully so that the images end up lining up, and then assembles them and prints them large all together, giving us these very kind of fractured looking images. And along the way he will methodically sometimes turn the camera on an angle to the left, to the right, to the left, to the right, creating yet another layer of shapes. This is the Guggenheim in Bilbao, which is still pretty recognizable despite the fact that it's been distorted by this technique. And here's the Colosseum, given the same treatment. This is by John Lair, and a commercial or industrial building with a house being reflected in its window, and all of the color is in the window, with everything surrounding it just being gray. This is by Lucy and Simon, who have done a series on urban nightscapes with usually just a single human visible. In this case, totally overwhelmed, but still very much visible, is this person on the walkway in the foreground. Another Lucy and Simon. And this is a great aerial by Alex McLean, with these almost entirely identical houses except for their colors, but on closer inspection you can see that there are subtle differences between them. People have customized the houses one way or another. It's almost like an inventory of houses, and at the same time quite beautiful, I think. This is by Andrew Moore. It's of a gypsy camp in Sarajevo, which has gone through shelling of one kind or another and gunfire. This is also by Andrew Moore, and it's Times Square in Manhattan. And one of the busier pictures one's likely to see. This is Tweed Hall in New York, and taken at a time when the light outside is lessening, allowing the light inside the building to become more prominent. So we have a nice balance between the interior and exterior light. And some pretty beautiful trees in the foreground. And this is St. Petersburg, a classical composition. This is by Catherine Opie, who grew up in the northern Midwest and recalled ice fishing houses like these, and went back recently to document them. This is by Martin Parr, British photographer and something of a photographic anarchist. It's about architecture, but not primarily. He has a great sense of humor. This is by Craig Michael Payne, and obviously a lengthy exposure. This is by Scott Peterman, who was commissioned by Vanity Fair to take this image reminiscent of one that I showed you earlier of by Bernice Abbott, taken from the Chrysler Building, looking down on buildings in Manhattan. And however, this is in color. It's a much brighter image, owing perhaps in part to the increased wattage of lighting in the city, but also more light-sensitive materials and techniques that are available to photographers now. This is the original by Bernice Abbott, and it's still, I think, an extraordinary image. This is by John Fall, who has been concerned with the effects of humans on the landscape. It's Canyon de Chelly, which I had shown an image of earlier. And clearly the cliff dwellings are second to the porta potty in the foreground. This is Timothy O'Sullivan's first image of Canyon de Chelly. No porta potties then. This is by Richard Ross, and a remarkably sad picture to me. But it's part of what photography is capable of. This is by Said Sung Leong, and I'm probably butchering the pronunciation of his name, but a photographer in the tradition of Andreas Gursky and Thomas Struth, Chinese photographer. This is by Frank van der Salm, and a very straightforward image aside from the fact that it's taken with this brooding sky and these blown out lights. Doesn't look quite real. This is also by van der Salm and has a surreal quality to it as well. This is by Mark Yankis, and reminiscent to me of the photo-secessionists Alfred Stieglitz and Edward Steichen, the turn of the 20th century, but here in color. This is an image by Edwin Zwackman, a Dutch photographer, and these are not real buildings. These are scale models that Zwackman had invented entirely, and his explanation is that they're like buildings he sees in his dreams, so they have a dreamy quality to them. He then takes the scale models that he's built and brings them into real environments, so we have this layer of reality behind this very surreal, imagined foreground.